Let me introduce today. He is obviously the head of SAZU here in Ljubljana.
Not the whole thing, just the institute.
Yeah. I was going to say that. I know you'd like to do that. And the research associate today also teaches at the Faculty of Arts at the University of Ljubljana. He's the author of 2 books and has published extensively on a range of topics, including Freudian and Lacanian psychoanalysis, Beckett, Deleuze, as well as also on more openly political issues. Crisis, the pandemic, populism, if I recall correctly. So you're active on both fronts, we could say. Today is also, you also translated into Slovenian works by Freud and Benjamin. The title of today's presentation today is The Latest, the Last and the Least, Remarks on the Freudian Method.
Thank you. Yeah, ChatGPT says that my most famous work is a paper on Deleuze, but this is the only author that I'm really not known for being like an expert in. So much. But when I asked it more precisely, he gave me better answers. So okay. Having opened the day with a discussion of one of the metapsychological papers, I think this discussion was really good. I'm really happy that it went that well. And having followed it up with Alejandro's, I think, remarkable lecture on the future and the past of metapsychology, in particular, is dispersion across the different registers of psychoanalytic experience, I now add my own contribution to essentially the same question. At the November conference, I adopted the perspective of considering metapsychology itself as a case study. This means, on one hand, viewing it as Freud's case, another one of his case studies, analogous to his studies of particular patients, as a case with its own prehistory and developmental phases existing side by side, with specific symptoms, fantasies, and ultimately elements of countertransference. Here, countertransference in this particular case signifies, I would say, Freud's defense against the excess of metapsychology by falling in love with its fantasy doppelganger, that is, mythology. On the other hand, investigating the case of metapsychology involved exploring what is the case of metapsychology. In this second understanding of the phrase, the case of metapsychology refers to an object intrinsic to metapsychology. I posited that this object is twofold. Firstly, it is the psychic apparatus in both its minimal and maximal definitions. So, what are the minimum common features of any individual psychic apparatus, and what the psychic apparatus is capable of producing? So, the minimal and the maximal of the psychic apparatus, perhaps even the collective psychic apparatus. This question still remains open, and this is what mass psychology is working on, right? Secondly, the proper object of metapsychology is one that necessarily gives rise to metapsychological speculation, so speculation typical or specific for psychoanalysis. Today I will take a slightly different approach. Instead of the subject matter of metapsychology, I will attempt to outline the more general features of Freud's method, or more precisely, the threefold nature of this method, which in its basic structure is common to both analytic technique and analytic theory, and which, I argue, also extends to metapsychological speculation proper. To be explicit right away, and to anticipate what I might as well end with, the Freudian method consists of 3 features, I argue. First, the affirmation of provisionality. That is full confidence in what is the latest. Second, the second feature, the ability to recognize what is that cannot fail to remain the latest. That is certainty about what is and will remain the last. final, irrevocable, irreplaceable. And the third feature, the minimalism of speculation, which is a synthesis, I would say, of boldness and humility towards the object, towards the material that it's been investigated, towards the material that appears as it appears. In principle, all three features of Freud's method are committed to empiricism, a certain kind of empiricism. And therein, of course, lies the core of Freud's skepticism towards philosophy, which simultaneously patches up the holes in the fabric of the world and refuses to see that, I quote Freud, quoting Hamlet many times, that there are more things in heaven and earth than it itself is capable of dreaming of. For psychoanalysis, this philosophical tendency poses a constant danger that psychoanalysis as a science will slip into an inherently heterogeneous Weltanschauung. The problem, however, is that what is perceived as a philosophical tendency is not a purely subjective whim that lies outside the object of science, of psychoanalysis as science. Speculation is something that a strictly consistent empiricist like Freud must recognize from time to time as a necessary requirement that arises precisely from material observation. The only question that then arises is there a kind of speculation proper to psychoanalysis, non-philosophical or anti-philosophical perhaps even, that preserves precisely the threefoldness of the method we have been talking about? Or, on the contrary, must psychoanalysis at some point recognize its inadequacy and becomes, so to say, a philosophy? Is there something in psychoanalytic research that forces psychoanalysis to become something else, at least temporarily, to detach itself from itself and to be guided, even if only temporarily, by a logic different from its own? I would say that the immediate way out of this dilemma is probably the following. In order for psychoanalysis to maintain its own kind of speculation, which is essentially characterized by the precept of the non-redundancy of speculation, and also the right time to speculate. So, in order to maintain its own kind of speculation, psychoanalysis had to borrow a certain concept from philosophy, at least at a preliminary stage, namely the concept of the Grenzbegriff, the boundary concept, the limiting concept, the concept at the limit. When Freud used this term in 1915 in Drives and Their Vicissitudes to describe the drive as a boundary concept, as a Grenzbegriff between the somatic and the psychic, we spontaneously understand it as a concept at the boundary between two sciences, as a concept that belongs to each of the two scientific disciplines in potential, but at the same time to neither of them. This understanding of the borderline concept of the Grenzbegriff may be the whole story for Freud, who knows, but it is definitely not the whole potential that the concept itself can open up in psychoanalysis. And at this point, it is probably time for a very specific person to come to the service of this concept. She's been mentioned already today. Namely, a person whom Freud, in a letter to Ferenczi, described as a woman of dangerous intelligence, and in a letter to her personally, as an understander par excellence. So, als eine Versteherin par excellence, who understands, this is a quote from Freud again, who understands more and better than what is presented to her, whose commentaries are, this is just another English translation, an amplification and improvement of the original. This figure is clearly Lou Andreas Salomé. Lou Andreas Salomé, as is well known, came into contact with psychoanalysis quite late in her life. In the end of summer 1912, she arrived in Vienna and regularly attended the meetings of the Vienna Psychoanalytic Association, and so fascinated Freud that when once she failed to appear at one of the meetings, he wrote to her in a letter, I quote, I missed you at the lecture yesterday. I have adopted the bad habit of always directing my lecture to a definite member of the audience, and yesterday I fixed my gaze as if spellbound at the place which had been reserved for you. So nobody should flatter themselves. Okay, but so the word that he used is at the place which had been reserved for you, in the Sitzlücke. So literally in the hole in the seat as a whole, right? In a diary entry on the 2nd November, after one of the meetings, Salomé anticipates, and there I go back to the Grenzbegriff, anticipates, amplifies, I would say, and brings into action the apparently simple and straightforward designation of the drive as a Grenzbegriff, so as a concept that doesn't belong to any of the two sciences, right? So I quote Salomé here. Apropos of the concept of drive, Freud made use of the customary definition that it rests on the organic. As long as the drive theory remains just that which physiologists and psychologists toss at one another, no further enlightenment can emerge from it, even with Freud. It also remains as a mere crutch, an unwilled inconsistency in our knowledge of nature and mind. Perhaps it can be attributed to this predicament that Adler ultimately could classify the instinctual life among the other symbolic forms of his psychic rules of the game. For if drive is only, so to speak, a limiting concept, Grenzbegriff, viewed from two aspects, then a specific property can be attributed to it only by means of a bilateral optical illusion. Once again, however, it is a mark of greatness in Freud how, untroubled by such philosophical worries, he merely proceeds to action on such questions. So he was able to sketch out a map of a whole country on the basis of this border region before anyone even knew whose land he was entering, with the sole aid of a few straggling trespassers, so people in the analysis, driven by necessity to disregard the border regulations. In mental illness, he grabbed hold of life by the coattails, just there where it appears to us squeezed helplessly into a cleft, unable to escape into the organic alone. And there he put it to the question. Indeed, Freud's great discovery cannot be better described than by saying that he made a virtue for science out of the necessity of mental life, end of quote. A few months later, after a debate on the problem of narcissism, debate at the Wednesday meeting, right, at the Wednesday gathering, she went one step further by using the term Grenzbegriff in a much more standard philosophical sense. In doing so, she is, after all, an understander par excellence, right? She draws on Freud in two ways. At the beginning of her entry, she first summarizes Freud, underlining that narcissism must be understood as a vestigial phenomenon, Restphänomen, which for the present will continue to be just that. This is a quote from Freud, Salomé quoting Freud, and where one must avoid trying to use it as a key to open up a lot of things that still remain undisclosed. And later she continues, I quote, narcissism in its creative form is no longer just a stage to be transcended. It is rather the persistent accompaniment of all our deeper experience, always present, yet still far beyond any possibility of hewing its way from consciousness into the unconscious. In narcissism, the unconscious still exists only en bloc, the primordial form not simply of a foundation, but of the all-inclusive. Freud is perfectly right in speaking of it, as he now does, as a limiting concept, Grenzbegriff, which serves as a receptacle for what remains unsolved and not a key to its solution. This formulation is repeated almost verbatim in a letter from early 1915, in which she comments on Freud's then already published essay. Especially the first type, that is primary narcissism, she writes, I quote, "cannot be pursued further empirically, and indeed at this point analysis comes to a halt altogether." Exactly as you say in words, this is a letter to Freud, in words which she repeated in conversation. Then she quotes Freud. Back again, the concept of narcissism is a borderline concept, Grenzbegriff, which should not be used indiscriminately as a key to everything, but should remain a reservoir for residual problems as yet unsolved and perhaps insoluble. Certainly, she goes on, it is very important not to turn it into something mysterious, for it does, after all, designate a fact which is accessible. And in my view, it is this concept which in the last resort really differentiates the Freudian unconscious in its essential nature from those elements of it which are utilized here and there by Adler, fiction, and Jung, his symbolic, end of quote. So the core of the Freudian concept of narcissism, which in the broadest sense denotes the ego's inability to be libidinally absolutely uninvested, that is, the inability for the ego to be autonomous with respect to libido and to manage it as it wills, is put by Salomé in this letter in the fact that the ego, I quote, as a product of development, is first differentiated from that subject-object uniform life, which we then rediscover as libido in the self-developing ego. But as she points out in her diary entry of 1913, so 2 years before, it is absolutely essential that the construction of primary narcissism serves us not as an answer, as a key, but once again as a Grenzbegriff, and more precisely as the Grenzbegriff of psychology or psychoanalysis. I mean, they were talking about psychology here, in this theoretical sense, I would say, perhaps. So, more precisely as the Grenzbegriff of psychology, as a concept in which psychology, on the one hand, steps on the border with biology, and on the other hand, on the border with philosophy. So not just with the other science, but also with philosophy, right? So here is one of the last longer quotes from Salomé, from Freud, from the journal, March 1913. Unquestionably, and this I guess is the most important quote, so it's worth listening to, right? Unquestionably, this point will come to be a burning issue, so the point of narcissism and stuff, and it can only be settled philosophically, she says. It is precisely here where Adler's organ concept begins his leap from the psychological into another realm of knowledge requiring other methods. To hold fast instead to Freud's present concept of narcissism means, in effect, to hold fast to psychology's right to its own media and methods, no matter what. And that means to be allowed to write with appropriate obscurity its personal mark of X, even there where the psychic organization eludes it, instead of defecting into the alien clarity belonging to another side of existence called the physical. It means to take seriously the principle stating that psychic and physical stand for each other, but neither determine nor explain the other, and hence cannot substitute for each other. The right to an obscurity of its own is very important. So so the right to an obscurity of its own is very important. Only the eye, she goes on, turned toward it, to this obscurity, only the eye turned toward it, to this obscurity, can find even the tiniest ray of illumination, not the eye diverted to an alien light. So it has come to Freud here and there. For this reason, too, the greatest emphasis must remain on the direction of discovery, and the purpose of philosophic argument would be to secure its place and its justification. In Freud's cause, philosophy can and ought to be merely ancillary to practical matters, but in them it has now become essential and is no longer to be circumvented. End of quote. For psychology, in this case psychoanalysis, of course, narcissism as a Grenzbegriff functions as a provisional concept that both loosens and reinforces the boundary of psychoanalysis. With this concept, as with all other Grenzbegriffe, psychology does indeed enter a field that is incomprehensible to it, but in such a way that it remains itself. So it doesn't change, it doesn't switch to becoming another scientific discipline. That it retains its perspective, its mole's eyes, the comparison is indeed Freud's own, and stares into an almost complete darkness. Here the decision is basically an ethical one. Although psychology is almost completely blind in this area, as a science it must assert the right to this almost complete blindness. But the ethical dimension here clearly cannot be reduced to a question of the right of psychology or psychoanalysis to make a decision on the basis of the previous scientific accomplishments of this same science, right? Two other strictly ethical elements also play a role. First, there is the question of persistence, the persistence of a particular science which, although it does not yet have the appropriate tools and may never have them, does the work in the name of general science, so to say, and does so because another discipline, which may have greater potential in the future, is at a lower stage at a given moment, so it sees even less. Thus, for example, Freud, in a clear echo of Salomé's considerations, reflects in the paper on narcissism of 1914. Since we cannot, I quote, since we cannot wait for another science to present us with the final conclusions on the theory of the instincts, it is far more to purpose that we should try to see what light may be thrown upon this basic problem of biology by a synthesis of the psychological phenomena. Let us face the possibility of error, but do not let us be deterred from pursuing the logical implications of the hypothesis we first adopted of an antithesis between ego instincts and sexual instincts, and so on. And from seeing whether it turns out to be without contradictions and fruitful, and whether it can be applied to other disorders as well, such as schizophrenia. End of quote. The third ethical element, Freud is an empiricist after all, concerns fidelity to the material that's been observed. The responsibility to keep its representation as minimally distorted as possible. As Freud replies in a letter from 1915, in which he responds to Salomé's reflections that brought her to the right to obscurity of its own, the problem with running off too quickly into another science or into philosophical speculation is that it never works out without further distortion. A short quote from Freud. I do not interpret your remarks on narcissism as objections, but rather as a stimulus to attempt a further conceptual and factual clarification of the subject. I am in agreement with what you say without being able to solve the problems you have raised, and now is the important part. I even acknowledge that Adler has an advantage over me in this matter. It is the advantage of someone imposing a system of thought upon things compared with someone who observes them and is anxiously concerned to do them justice. I comfort myself with the thought that it is not the task of science to simplify the world, or at least not its first task. End of quote. So, narcissism, considered as Grenzbegriff, fulfills a double function in Freudian psychoanalysis. On the one hand, it prevents psychoanalysis from being immediately absorbed by another science when it goes beyond its limit. On the other hand, it nonetheless recognizes the fact that psychoanalysis did reach its limits, and that the psychoanalyst, as a committed empiricist, must inevitably make a move from observation to provisional speculation. In this sense, narcissism is a concept that is not only the Grenzbegriff of psychology, but also, I would say, the provisional, I emphasize provisional, Grundbegriff of metapsychology. Another quote from Freud very, very quickly. On the subject itself, I would like to observe that my account of narcissism is in the first place what I shall one day describe as metapsychological, that is purely conditioned by topographical dynamic factors without relation to the conscious processes. The cases in which you are interested refer preeminently to conditions where this process becomes conscious, which cannot apply to genuine and naive narcissism, and so on and so on. So, and then he ends, the disregarding of conscious conditions and the acceptance of the metapsychological way of thought are as difficult as they are indispensable. So we can see that Freud and Salomé are practically talking the same things, and it's just, it looks that Salomé is a small step ahead of Freud in this articulation, but Freud can easily catch her in this, of course, in this philosophical kind of articulation, maybe. So, in this letter, Freud reactivates, after more than 15 years, or like, okay, let's say 10 years, a signifier that first appeared in a letter to Fliess, as already mentioned, right? And which, as is well known, becomes the label for the project with the rather cautious working title Zur Vorbereitung einer Metapsychologie. The essay on narcissism was not directly part of this project, but what is known is that it included 5 published and 7 unpublished and lost writings. This is what we heard before. Sorry, didn't know that. Okay, it's not. I think it's worth repeating it. So, on the one hand, the project is clearly a consequence. So, when we think how did Freud came to write like 12 papers in 3-4 months. What could be the reasons behind this? On the one hand, the project is clearly a consequence of Freud's decision to break definitively and openly with Jung and Adler. So we had this, the text of 1914 that he considered to be like a bomb that would kind of finally destroy these connections. And the funny thing is it happened like a month before the war began. So instead of people reacting to this bomb, then they went to their shelters for other reasons, so for the real bomb. This is quite funny that Freud uses these metaphors, I think even twice in those letters. So anyway, on the other, so this could be one reason. So Freud's decision to break with Jung and Adler and to explain, just to make it clear, these are my positions. And in a way, Freud perhaps considered this to be his final word, perhaps. So zur Vorbereitung, a preparation for metapsychology, you know what this means usually. So it's done once and never again, right? So on the other hand, it is, I would say, the natural outcome of the trajectory established by the analysis of Schreber and the formulations of the 2 principles of mental functioning, but also by speculative elements of the technical writings of 1912 and 1913, already discussed today as well. And of course, by the seminal essay on narcissism as well. The project that preoccupied Freud in the first year of the war, after he had recovered from the initial shock, of course, was something that Salomé pursued from the beginning. And when we read the correspondence, we cannot help but notice her persistent question of where the hell the book he was supposed to write disappeared to. But that's a story for another time. At this point, I will go back a few years when Salomé, after her second visit to a Wednesday meeting, witnesses Freud's pure empiricism in person for the first time, the essential element of which is the flexibility of the theoretical premises. I quote Salomé from the journal. Freud seated me at his side and made a very sweet remark. He gave the paper. During the discussion, we talked quietly together on various matters. During the discussion, that's interesting. I was surprised how readily he acquiesced to a view of neurosis as a conflict between libido and ego instead of proceeding unilaterally from the libido. When I commented that I read otherwise in his books, he said, my latest formulation, meine letzte Formulierung. And that corresponds with my general impression, she goes on, that the theory is by no means hidebound, festgenagelt, but is adjusted to further findings, sich weiter nach den Erfahrungen regelt. And further, that this man is great simply in that he is the man of research, advancing quietly and working tirelessly. And then she adds, perhaps the dogmatism with which he is reproached derives from the necessity to establish guidelines in the course of his tireless advance, if only for the sake of his fellow workers. So, the saying that Freud was a dogmatist, Salomé claims, is just the result of his being willing to simplify things. So for his followers, to enable them to follow him, basically, right, in this literal sense. Okay, this quotation shows Freud operating on two levels. On the one hand, in relation to himself and his own theory, he has no difficulty in giving full provisional credence to his latest theoretical formulation, as he had done with the previous one, which was also provisional, and so on and so on, and so on and so on. On the other hand, Freud does something else. He establishes points of orientation, which at some point arose according to the same empiricist approach, and have not been completely abandoned, even if they have been suspended at a certain level. The accusation of dogmatism is false insofar as it confuses these elements which are intended to prevent deviation from the psychoanalytic trajectory with positively made like building blocks of the system. So dogmatism sees those elements of old concepts and so on, sees as like something that like building blocks of the system, but Freud only uses them and talks about these simple things just to make sure that his followers won't deviate from the trajectory, which is not so fixated and not strictly determined. So as a corollary to this observation by Lou Salomé, consider the following passage from a letter in 1914 in which Freud first characterizes Adler as a loathsome person and then continues. So first he says this guy is just shit, right? And then he goes on. I have never objected to differences of opinion among members of the psychoanalytic circle, especially as I myself usually have several views on a matter until, that is to say, I have expressed one of them in print. But one must stick to the fundamental core. An der Einheitlichkeit des Kerns muss man aber festhalten. So one must stick to the unity of the core. Otherwise, it becomes something else. Freud sees no problem in holding different opinions on a given subject. He himself admits that he often holds several opinions about the same thing. There is no automatism in interpreting phenomena. The problem is not directly reflected in the interpretation, but rather generates, let's say, several approximations which must be weighed against each other until one of them is printed, right? On another level, there exists a single, unified, indivisible, and indisputable core that one must adhere to, no other way. In short, there is a difference between the opinions, one of which prevails by semi-contingent gestures of becoming public, and the core which, once established, takes its final form. This form cannot be changed without transforming the core into something else. And for psychoanalysis, which calls itself like this, becomes something else, maybe worthy of further research, but it's just not psychoanalysis anymore. But what does this core look like? Does it amount to the structure that opponents regard as dogmatic? Does it contain fundamental concepts and defined links between them? How is this core formed? In psychoanalysis, I argue, this core is not formed, but rather formulated. There are formulas that were designed at a certain point in time, but have remained in psychoanalysis. And not only it is impossible to get rid of them or forget about them, but any attempt to separate oneself from them results in the critical voice being thrown out of the orbit of psychoanalysis. This is clearly most evident in Lacanian psychoanalysis. I doubt you can imagine Lacan saying, let's say, I've been doing some thinking, and I no longer believe that the big other does not exist. Or, I've been doing some thinking, and I've realized that the signifier isn't really what represents the subject for another signifier. Or, it just occurred to me that I fucked it up. There is a sexual relationship. And so on, right? And it's hard to imagine a Lacanian that would dare to dispute the formulas. A Lacanian will ponder relentlessly the meaning of a particular formula, but it will never occur to a Lacanian to reject the formula itself. In psychoanalysis, formulas are strictly irreproachable, I would say. In Freud, I would argue, there was a point in time when he himself created this disposition. When he decided to act like a faithful Freudian himself, being faithful to his own formulas, insisting on a certain formula when it would have been much easier to refute it. And to come back to the topic we started with this morning, this formula was constructed as a formula in the interpretation of dreams. In the interpretation of dreams, we encounter two key hypotheses, two basic statements. The first is every dream has a meaning, right? With this hypothesis, Freud places the problem of dreams in the basic framework of psychoanalysis, which follows the rule that nothing can be declared neutral, irrelevant in advance. In doing so, Freud definitely takes the basic step of paying attention to every element in the interpretation without any pre-ranking at the outset. Every dream and everything in the dream can be included in the field of meaning somehow. Every dream has a meaning, and potentially every element in a particular dream is a building block of meaning of this dream. But this, But this hypothesis is only a necessary condition, I would say, not yet a sufficient one. For Freud to have written the interpretation of dreams in the way he did, and the key part of it is precisely the speculative chapter on the dream work, of course, this hypothesis was not sufficient. So claiming that every dream has a meaning was not sufficient. For the interpretation of dreams to become the turning point of psychoanalysis, as he says in the new introductory lectures, so he said that interpretation of dreams was the Wendepunkt, so a turning point, which established a trajectory from which psychoanalysis would never deviate. A second hypothesis was needed, namely the one with which he concludes the chapter in which he gives his interpretation of the dream of Irma's injection. The dream is a fulfillment of a wish. We've heard this one before today. It is well known that this formula gains precision over the course of the book, right? An emphasis that it is the fulfillment of an unconscious wish or unconscious desire, the fulfillment of the drive wish, the Triebwunsch, which, like every other drive, can aspire to nothing other than its own satisfaction, which is, according to Freud, the purpose of all dreaming, der Sinn alles Träumens, all the sense that dreaming has, right, to enable satisfaction to the Triebwunsch. And yet, this precisation was conditioned by a specific Freudian gesture. We know that in some dreams it is quite obvious that they are wish fulfillments, in the most banal sense. But as soon as slightly more complex dreams appear, this obvious correspondence breaks down. And this is where Freud's gesture comes into play. At the moment when he is faced with a discrepancy between the formula and the material, between the formula and the particular dream, Freud decides to proceed regardless with the same formula. No. Every dream is a fulfillment. Dream is a fulfillment of wish, no matter what. It's not just that in the end, all dreams turn out to really be wish fulfillment. What is essential is the process, is the establishment of a peculiar double motion, I would say, in which, on the one hand, the meaning of the formula is modified, the meaning of what fulfillment means is modified, what the desire or wish means is modified, who is the subject of this fulfillment is modified, etc. And B, also the meaning of what initially did not correspond to the formula is modified. The meaning of what is realized fear, what is the conclusion that continues into sleep, what is anxiety, everything modifies just by sticking to the same formula and not giving up on it. The relation between the concept and its material, which is directly fused in a simple situation, like, I go to sleep hungry and I dream about eating, right? So that would be the simple wish fulfillment, which is based on a need. I mean, close to the need, but you know what I'm saying? So the relation between the causal and its material, which is directly fused in a simple situation, is ideally no less fused when it comes to more complex situations, except that this coupling requires, as it were, a comprehensive conceptual construction which is not limited to a particular element of the material, but to the whole system. And of course, the final step in this process is to maintain this complexity even in the face of apparently simple situation, even when it comes to infantile dreams that suddenly turn into a semblance of simplicity. So, no, you were not dreaming about eating because you were hungry. So, but at the same time, this was the fulfillment of your wish. And indeed, this formula, if this formula deserves the label, I once said that it deserved this label. I mean, the label of the fundamental formula of psychoanalysis, it concerns precisely its potential to correct within psychoanalysis the permanent danger of slipping into a conception of the unconscious, which, within the theory of dreams, would confine itself to their latent thought and would understand the rest of the material as indifferent. The reason at the end that dreams are always, that the desire, the wish is always fulfilled in every dream, the reason is that at their core, they are nothing other than an affirmation of the irreducible factum of the unconscious, the dreams, that is. So the affirmation of the irreducible factum of the unconscious, which in principle pervades the entire psychic structure. So it kind of makes sense that why it's at the same time, that you were dreaming of eating because you were hungry, but at the same time you were dreaming of eating because of some other reasons. But the whole system was dreaming, right? And this was included in the same. So, and everything kind of becomes, it's not that separated anymore. So I only have 5 minutes more, so this formula, if we pay attention, encapsulates all three features of the Freudian method that I outlined at the beginning, like some 40 minutes ago. First, Freud clings to and activates the formulation that appears to him as the latest, after analyzing a dream of Irma's injection. Even if this formulation or this statement or this hypothesis, even if it is less consolidated and less convincing at this embryonic stage than the competing thesis that all dreams have a meaning. Second, this formula is, as I have already pointed out, in this specific sense, the last, irreplaceable, of course, as a disposition that allows for complements, metapsychological complements, supplements, especially if they're it allows. So it is last, it is irreplaceable, but as a disposition, of course. You can work on this formula. You can, work on the basis of this formula afterwards, but the formula sticks. And third, as a formula, it is also by its nature reduced to the minimum, of course. That makes it a formula. And yet, of course, this formula is not metapsychological in itself. It is not without relation to the conscious processes, just insofar as the phrase X is the fulfillment of a wish is modeled, I would say, upon a standard conscious judgment, and only receives its unconscious content through the translation of the unconscious to the conscious wording. This formula produces Freud, it produces the theoretical disposition of psychoanalysis, but it is not yet itself grounded in a metapsychological perspective. The latter is once again without relation, ohne Rücksicht, so doesn't care, right? Also, that would also mean doesn't care, has no relation to conscious processes. But not simply because the observer is entirely placed in the field of the unconscious as opposed to consciousness, but because he is situated in a field where this difference is as such is suspended, namely a difference which inevitably implies the moment of uncovering, Entdeckung. An example of genuine metapsychological insight, that is, insight which, without being aware of it, is already metapsychological, already without relation to conscious processes, and which, after this recognition, requires a further effort of speculation, is to be found in the essay to which I have already referred, namely to the essay on narcissism, more precisely in the third section, where he introduces the notion of the ego ideal. I quote from Freud. This ideal ego, he shifts, right, ideal ego at that point, but it's the same concept, it's just being born, right? This ideal ego is now the target of the self-love which was enjoyed in childhood by the actual ego. The subject's narcissism makes its appearance displaced onto this new ideal ego, which, like the infantile ego, finds itself possessed of every perfection that is of value. As always, where the libido is concerned, man has here again shown himself incapable of giving up a satisfaction he had once enjoyed. He is not willing to forego the narcissistic perfection of his childhood. And when, as he grows up, he is disturbed by the admonitions of others and by the awakening of his own critical judgment, so that he can no longer return that perfection, he seeks to recover it in the new form of an ego ideal. What he projects before him as his ideal is the substitute for the lost narcissism of his childhood, in which he was his own ideal, end of quote. The primary narcissism that once appeared as perfection refuses to retreat, and it finds substitutes to persevere in a new configuration when, I quote, it is disturbed by the admonitions of others and by the awakening of his own critical judgment. But when the ego seeks to deceive reality and gain control over its own satisfaction, it literally is given control. I quote, "It would not surprise us if we were to find a special psychical agency which performs the task of seeing that narcissistic satisfaction from the ego ideal is ensured, and which, with this end in view, constantly watches the actual ego and measures it by that ideal." End of quote. And it is precisely this anticipation of what will later become known as the superego, of course, that constitutes the genuine, this is what constitutes the genuine metapsychological insight, the genuine theoretical counterpart of what Freud captures in analytical practice with the term gleichschwebende Aufmerksamkeit, or free-floating attention, which refers to an attention in which, quite superhumanly, all judgment is suspended, but like the analyst just keeps memorizing without being aware of memorizing, but having no judgment at certain point. So no interpretation, no judgments, not whatever. Such an agency cannot be uncovered. It is not a matter of Entdeckung, of removing a surface to reveal some specific content. This is Freud, what Freud's claim. Here's the word. So it's not a matter of Entdeckung, of removing a surface to reveal some specific content. Such an agency can only be recognized, says Freud. And to see it is see in it something we already know, but did not realize was a manifestation of a specific agency. The verb he uses in German is agnoszieren, which denotes a purely superficial statement, especially in Austrian usage, where it is used. I had to check in the dictionary, but it is used to recognize a corpse, right? So by the teeth, you recognize this is Tadej Troha, for instance, right? That lies here, or used to be, at least. So, just like on the surface, just claiming this specific phenomenon, something that lies here, this substance, is this, right? This provisional concept, let's say. This agnostieren denotes a purely superficial statement that a certain object has the required characteristics, right? We always knew that conscience existed, but it always appeared to be the product of some sort of rationality, of being habituated by values, by knowing what is right and what is wrong, right? So this is where conscience probably is derived from. Now we see the precondition of its existence, the existence of the pure possibility of being watched, being observed, being forced to do what we thought was a matter of our deliberation and what was under our control. This instance, the superego is ohne Rücksicht on our conscious processes and literally does not care what we want. As Freud continues, and this is the last quote and the second to last paragraph, recognition of this agency enables us also to understand the so-called delusions of being noticed, or more correctly, of being watched, which are such striking symptoms in paranoid diseases and which may also occur as an isolated form of illness or intercalated in a transference neurosis. Patients of this sort complain that all their thoughts are known and their actions watched and supervised. A power of this kind, watching, discovering, and criticizing all our intentions, does really exist. Indeed, it exists in every one of us in normal life. End of quote. This agnoszierung of the self of a certain self-observing instance is, as I said, a genuine example of metapsychological insight, which, unlike the schema we have followed so far, captures all three moments simultaneously, all three features of Freudian methods simultaneously. So, a speculation reduced to a minimum which merely detects, merely registers the possibility of a reversal, which is the least of speculation, in that it imposes itself on us, but which as such is also the latest, the very next, the only possible next step after observing it, and which immediately acquires certainty that this is also, in essence, the last thing we have to say about it, the final thing of this register. We can say more, of course, about the superego. We can try to explain what it is, and so on, but no explanation can surpass the impact of a mere marker of the existence of this instance. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Today we have 10 tops 15 minutes for a Q&A session, which I open.
Thank you, Tadej, for your paper. While I was listening to your paper, I couldn't help recalling John Forrester's critique and fascination on how Freud was able to, say, translate feelings into theory. However, if we look into his case studies, it seems that everything goes wrong. They go wrong in so many ways. So the question basically is, how do you think Freud avoids this trap? Say, is he thinking metapsychologically, or is he just pushing or forcing theory into the clinical phenomena?
Into the?
Clinical phenomena.
Okay. I would say that he used these case studies, well, you can see, right? I would say that if you take like these 5 case studies, the major case studies, he uses, I would say, and I was talking about this at a certain conference, maybe here or somewhere else, about the rat man, and where he, I don't know, this is the place where the concept of ambivalence was basically born, right? The way he responded to that story, right? So in that case, it's more about the object that he found in there. So I would say the object of metapsychology. So something that kind of kept him wonder. I mean, he just had to perhaps invent. He had to see that there is, like maybe not just ambivalence, but maybe even the concept of jouissance was invented there, or maybe registered in some sense. But in Schreber, for instance, I always thought that Schreber's analysis is the first metapsychological paper proper, and the one on projection, and precisely because I think what was important, that I would say that metapsychology precisely could become like a proper metapsychology only after the Vienna Circle, right, included narcissistic neurosis, psychoneurosis into something they could work with. So before you have included like psychosis or paranoia, whatever word you would they used back then, it was just not complete. I mean, so as I said in the beginning, right? So if the psychic apparatus is the object of metapsychology, it has first to be seen like like what is minimal to every case, every manifestation of psychic apparatus, but also what can possibly psychic apparatus produce. So before we included like this, the possibility of for instance, to understand persons that don't care about that have no connection. I mean, that turn words into things proper, right? And those words get some strange energy, the one that we were talking about in the morning. So in this, the third metapsychological element, the psychic energy was basically, I would say, confirmed with the discovery that words can somehow have this pseudo energy, like that words are capable of just turning around, beginning to mean something that in a, let's say, Freud, he uses in the unconscious, he uses this example, right? He says that a neurotic, when he mentions a small like hole in the skin, right, he would never dream of connecting it to a sexual organ, right? But a psychotic could, right? Because it's just the hole. You know what I mean? He just doesn't refer to it. It's just whole, and whatever can be inscribed underneath. I mean, in this context. Some babbling. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Today, thank you very much. I really enjoyed. It was great, and I'm especially thankful to you for your fine lines about superego. You know, I think that solves a lot of troubles. I was working on my own paper. I don't have a question. I have a suggestion, rather, that goes into some sort of a concept. At the very beginning, you mentioned a remark of Freud about Salomé. And I think this remark somehow, there was a lot of ink spilled on it, but somehow elucidates this fascination of Nietzsche, Rilke, Freud, etc. with Salomé. And Freud's remark was that she's a Versteherin par excellence. And I think you should go further. I mean, following Lacan, and Lacan coined the concept subject supposed to know, and Zizek later subject supposed to desire, subject supposed to believe, and subject supposed to enjoy, etc. Here we have an example of subject supposed to understand. I think somehow it seems redundant because for Lacan there's a big other as an instance, you know, you're always speaking to, but I guess it would be very productive to see this instance personalized in a way. In a way, somehow by a persona, by somebody who really understands, who really gets it, who really, and also in a critique of ideology, this is also a very powerful moment when you are speaking to somebody who understands.
Can I just answer that?
Okay.
It just came to my mind. Yeah, I kind of agree. I mean, but so with this, I would say it's interesting in the letters that how this, you know, when she writes to him and he says, you know, for the first couple of times he says, "Oh, this is your." I mean, he always says, "Your letter is so much better than what I gave you. You give me so much more. You know, you understand things better. You embellish them. You make, you know, just like you understand." This is where, but when he's not feeling that great, you can kind of see in the letter that he's just annoyed by her being dangerously intelligent in this sense. So yeah, I mean, just what I'm saying, it's not a shoulder to cry on, or I mean, somebody, okay, I can tell you everything. It has this ambivalent, right, meaning. Just what? Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Yeah, just keep it short. Yeah, like 3 more questions.
Okay. Mine, it's not even a question, it's just a remark. Apropos, really great paper and great insights, as always, especially the one apropos the irreversibility of the psychoanalytic formulas and their inventions. And I think the most extreme case when this is like proven that your reading is right is the moment where Freud all of a sudden encounters the contradiction between 2 formulas. Mm-hmm. And obviously it's a commonplace, it's a most notorious place, it's the in Beyond Pleasure principle, where he finds the Wiederholungszwang, the dynamics of the, but therein, and that's really, I think supports your reading, is that he doesn't devaluate in any way the basic formula from the interpretation of dream. The dreams are the fulfillments of the wish. He just adds, we need to, like considering the dynamics of the dead drive, we just need to conceive for the time being where the dreams were not, did not tend to the fulfillment of the wish. So it's not that he devaluates or dismisses this formula and replaces it with the new one, even when he finds the contradiction between, or supposed contradiction between two formulas, keeps them together. So it's not that the old formula is not operative anymore, but that they are start cohabitating with one another.
Yeah. It's a comment, right? Yeah.
You have a reply?
No, I don't think it requires any replies. I mean, I just wanted to say, maybe I can add that yeah, it's good not to understand it as okay, that even with Lacan, that he does some of the formulas could be in contradiction, right? But it's just the point was that this an old formula, when it becomes a formula, just remains in a way true. Attest to something, to some aspect, maybe it's true in a certain register and wrong in another register, but it's just the way, so I agree. Thanks.
Yeah, but my question is on a very similar note as that one, but with some concern, because I mean, very good paper. Thank you. The issue with the formula not being falsifiable is, on the one hand, either it is completely empty or it's a pure construction, right? I mean, it doesn't matter to what it refers. You can decide to what it refers based on the context and blah 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 blah. And in this sense, it's perhaps that psychoanalysis, as Lacan says very late, I think it's seminar 24, is not a science because, at least in Popperian terms, it's not falsifiable. Which would then, lead to a number of questions. Is there a separate function, verification, in which a formula, but even leaving all of these things aside, do you think that it's conceivable within psychoanalysis that there would be a different function from that of a formula, which would take us out of this paradigm of falsification versus verification, namely a formalization in which there would be some kind of you'd actually be able to refute a formalization in a way where, psychoanalytically speaking, you cannot refute a formula for the reasons that you've said, or is that perhaps a limit with Freud? Because I think very much with Lacan that is the point. So,
yeah, I mean, can you? I go. I mean, I go the other way. Can you reduce the myth of a primal father, right? I mean, not reduce. I mean, can you just claim that it's wrong? It's hard to say. I mean, it would be stupid to say no. This myth doesn't count, or it's not. You know what I'm saying? Just like perhaps it goes on. What I was trying to show basically was, it's not an answer to your questions, but just like maybe another explanation. What I was trying to show, maybe to just push the Freudian invention perhaps a step further in the development of psychoanalysis, so not to subscribe to Lacan's things that he himself wouldn't, basically. So it's just, I just think that not just like they would say, maybe can even say that objet is basically Freudian invention, right? It is, I think, and everything is kind of not just those strange objects, but it's also the structure, like just like the reduced to the minimum, the last provisional at the same time. So it's not refutable. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, if someone has
but yes, everything is possible, I would say. Yeah.
If someone has another question,
not in a linear sense.
I'm almost asking the same question again. So, but I was thinking also about the formulation of the last and the relation between the last and the latest. And I liked very much your description of sort of the, not casual, but in a way actually disciplined and scientific reformulation of the concepts or the elements of the wish fulfillment idea or principle. That made me think about this old joke that Zizek used to tell about Rabinovich, who won a car in the lottery. And then it turned out it was not a car but a bicycle, and he didn't actually win it, but it was stolen from him. So there's something that the question is, how far can you go in this reinterpretation of the concepts constituting a principle before the principle itself turns into something else or its opposite? Or is that a problem even? I mean, that maybe that's the work that many of us are doing in a way, is to constantly reinterpret certain concepts in a way that it changes the very idea of what, for example, wish fulfillment means. I don't know, but in a way it is the same question, I think.
I don't think I have an answer right now. Just let this question kind of be the. It's a smarter question than my answer would be. So.
Can I ask something? I think it builds up on what Enrich and Paris were saying, because, I mean, wonderful paper, by the way. Threefold method of Freud, right? So latest, provisionality, last, irrevocable, least, minimalism. That's still Lacan's method. And actually, in Lacan, especially very late Lacan, you find instances where he says very openly, I fucked it up. I treated the imaginary as the bad order, that I fucked it up.
Yeah, why not?
I underestimated the power of religion, I fucked it up. So what is the difference in the method? So what I'm basically saying here, Lacan would seem to be just Freud. The difference is, I think, point 3, the least. There is still too much in Freud for Lacan to say that is the least. Why? Because you don't move from formula to formalization. So it goes back to the points that were being made. Would you agree, or you think like actually that move from formula to formalization can be done in a non-Lacanian way? So you can go beyond Freud, remaining Freudian, but without being Lacanian, because that is what makes Lacan Lacan in my view.
But
Is Freudian?
Yeah, but the problem is, does it still allow you, just to if you forget about those previous steps, for instance, you move to formalization, can you even, I would just put it just really blindly, does this help you see things differently in reality? I mean, is there a way back, just to keep this connection, because it's a method of observation basically with Freud always, right? So it's empiricism, and in this sense, maybe this could be, I don't have the answer, but this is the crucial question for me, right? Just like.
Sorry, but fascinating conversation, because when you ended up saying in Freud, actually, you need a marker. Right? And that's the least, the marker, because the marker is still close to empiricity, right? So otherwise you trespass into philosophy. And I think the Lacanian argument would be to say, yes, but the best market, that's correct.
The best market is...
best marker...
is the free one.
Which is less than the Freudian least, is precisely the latter qua formalized.
Yeah, I agree.
So you stay closer to the unconscious.
Yeah, it's just, I even think that this discovery of the superego on narcissism, right? Just thought there could be something, sort of an instance. I'm not naming it. Actually, is a better concept than superego, I would say, because it kind of allows when you have the superego, you have to ask yourself, okay, is there a difference between a paranoid superego and a obsessional superego? But then you see that maybe this superego is better suited to a neurosis, right? And this is just something else, just this projection and this turning around of from the active to passive, for instance. I mean, just like there is something, I am being observed and there is somebody doing the observation. Yeah, okay. I think,
Thank you very much.
Thanks.